I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It is an incredible honor and pleasure. We are going to get into some really good content today. And I just want to say thank you for so consistently supporting the ministry. Again, this is something that God has called me into, and I thank you for joining me in what he wants to do. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today, who's joining us, Sean St. John. Sean has been a social worker and counselor in private practice for the past 12 years. He holds both a bachelor's and clinical master's degree in social work from UBC, as well as a PhD in social work and sociology. His research focus on vicarious trauma and burnout among helping professionals. His research focus is on vicarious trauma and burnout among helping professionals. Sean has worked in child welfare as a child protection worker and then as a family preservation counselor. He also worked as a mental health case manager with WorkSafe BC, adjudicating occupational mental health claims. Currently, he teaches graduate level social work and is the director of the Masters of Social Work Field Education and also is an assistant at professor at King University in Tennessee. In his counseling practice, Sean works with individuals struggling with anxiety and depression, post-traumatic and occupation stress, burnout, and relationship issues using cognitive, psychodynamic, and faith-based approaches. Sean has been a disciple of Jesus since '96, and he lives with his wife, Erin, and their 3 children in Vancouver, Canada. Sean, welcome to the channel, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was a mouthful. Those were some gymnastics there to get through that.
You've done a lot, and that's why I'm excited about having you on today. First, tell us a little bit about your conversion, and then why did you decide to go into research?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot that happened between my conversion and going to research. Baptized in '96 in the campus ministry. Grew up kind of going to church, off and on. I became an atheist at one point. I was very disillusioned with the church. I saw a lot of hypocrisy, and it's weird. And my family's fairly liberal. I actually oddly rebelled against them by becoming a disciple. Some people go the other way. They stop going to church and they start listening to like heavy metal music and doing crazy stuff. But I actually became kind of straight-laced and freaked them all out. So baptized in Vancouver. It was a great experience. We had this really tight-knit campus ministry. I was like one of 2 white people in the campus ministry. So for me, church was like this totally revolutionary thing, and totally changed my worldview. And it was great, and I loved it. And I think what got me into social work was I had been doing all this stuff, studying the Bible with lots of people. And I remember walking down the street with his brother one time. I was his discipler, and he was really having a rough go. Like he was struggling with depression, and I had no idea what that meant. And I remember at one point he turned to me and he said, Sean, I don't want to sound prideful, but I just don't think you're qualified to help me. And I do remember that feeling of anger that came up for me, like, yeah, maybe you are prideful. But then as I kind of thought about it, I realized, I'm really not qualified. And I mean, looking back now, I realized, this guy probably would have met the conditions for major depressive disorder. He probably needed professional intervention, and I wasn't really able to help him. So that pushed me to go back to school to finish my degree. And I got into social work because it felt really congruent with our family of churches. It's very boots on the ground. It's not fancy. It sort of gets the job done. And that seemed to really match my worldview, my faith. So went into social work, became a child protection worker, which is like crazy. It's this really insane field where you see and do things that you never thought you would do. And they say, there's a saying that research is me search. So I actually think that the reason I I went back for my PhD was because I was burned out. I was struggling with various kinds of trauma based on my work. Um, there was, you know, this kind of parade of social workers coming into my office, one by one, saying, "Look, I'm struggling," and they'd be in tears. They'd start so idealistically, and they'd come in with this passion to help people, and within like a few months, maybe a year, they would be totally burned out. They would be disillusioned. They would be they'd be ready to throw in the towel. And meanwhile, they just finished like a 4-year degree program. They put their whole life into this thing, and now they were done. And they say that the average lifespan of a child protection worker is about 14 months on average, depending on the research. So they don't have a long shelf life. And if you look at the sort of the psychological and emotional damage that happens, it's quite high. There's other research that suggests that up to 70% of child protection workers have at least one major symptom of PTSD, and 34% are actually diagnosable with full-blown PTSD, which is pretty brutal. If you consider that if you have like true PTSD, like diagnosed PTSD, there's a 50% chance you're going to take those symptoms to the very end of your life. So what that means is that if you become a child protection worker, there is about a 15% chance that you will incur permanent psychological damage just because you entered the profession. And it's like, how many jobs would we, like if you were at a job interview, the hiring manager, is taking you around the plant, and you're seeing like 70% of the workers have like bandages on their arms, and 15% of the workers are missing an arm. At some point you might say like what's with the arms? And if he told you, well, actually, if you work here, there's a 15% chance you're going to lose your left arm just because it's such a dangerous occupation. How many of us would take that job? Like, I think very few of us. I think most of us would walk out the door. But when it comes to mental health, we tend not to see it that way. Like, we don't know what we're getting into. And sometimes we can get into these high stress occupations that we have no idea yet what's going to happen, but they can be very damaging. So I thought, hey, let's swim upstream, and I had this experience where, I'd been asked to be in a meeting with this father who had had his children removed because of violence and alcohol use. And I remember it was me and this other social worker named Pat, and Pat was amazing. I think they brought me in because I'm like a bigger guy, not because of like my clinical skills, but I was like the muscle. And I remember he was so mad, like he was really angry, and he was super escalated. And I watched Pat sort of move in. It's almost like a boxer, sort of bobbing and weaving with him. And she was like making these little jokes, and I'm sitting there going, why are you joking? Like what are you doing? But I watched over the course of about 5 or 6 minutes, she just sort of solved him and unlocked him and was able to de-escalate him completely to the point where he was laughing. He was fine with the plan moving forward. And I remember he left, and I was like, Pat, like, what was that? Like, that was like a masterful performance. Like, where did you pick up those skills? And it was truly something to behold. I wish I could have recorded it. And she said, well, I was one of 7 children growing up. My father was a raging alcoholic, and I was the only one who could keep him from totally losing it and hurting all of us. I was the only one. And so they'd send me in because I could calm him down. And so she wasn't drawing on her skills as a social worker. She was drawing on her own childhood history. And it was like the superpower she had. But connected to that is the fact that this is the other piece, is that she took the next 2-3 days off. She took sick days. She didn't come in the next day because it also took a toll. So that thing that was her superpower was also her kryptonite. It also really it took a toll on her psychologically. And so that made me really curious. So I started researching, what is it about, social workers' early childhood trauma that makes them really well suited to the role of being a child protection worker, but also how does that plant seeds of their own destruction? And I did find both in the research. So at the end of the day, I just want to help people and provide a bit of a few tools and some insight for those choosing that field. So that's kind of the long version of that story.
Love it. There's so many things. In fact, just for our audience, I've met you. I met you within the last few months,
Mhm.
and I remember our first conversation. You had mentioned your research, and I hadn't taken a look at it yet. And I remember when we talked about it, and I was. You didn't know this, but I was crawling in my skin that day because I was personally triggered. Again, burnout versus triggered. There's this murkiness, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes when we think we're burned out, which your research we'll talk about in a moment. Anyway, when we had talked, I felt better
Mm.
because you helped to name part of what, relationship is a contact sport.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you kind of named in a very just short period of time that aspect of when you give and you pour yourself out, whether it be in a ministerial sense, whether it be whatever
Mhm.
occupational, professional, familial, relational sense, when you pour yourself out, depending on how you pour and the context, there's an expenditure.
Mhm.
And we're human. We're more human than we think. So I love that idea of just naming it. I find that for a lot of my audience, they're in the process of naming things
Mhm.
that felt for so long, but for the first time, there's words for it.
Mhm.
And that's when the healing can begin, typically when the naming starts. So
Right.
just thank you so much for that. That's so helpful.
Yeah. Well, and there's this idea that once we can name something, that we take it out of the realm of the somatic, like it stops living in our body so much, and it goes into our brain. And once we can tell a story about it, that's really a huge step toward healing that trauma. Because so often we get triggered and we don't even realize. All we know is that we're feeling something really powerful, and that feeling is it's moving us to do something or to not do something. We may not have insight as to why that feeling's coming up for us. So once we can move that into this more cognitive place where we can add it to our story, it totally changes the game for us, because then we can start using our prefrontal cortex to deal with that part of our life instead of our limbic system, which is just designed to keep us alive, right?
Yeah. So what I want to do now is I want to get into a
Yeah.
little bit of the nitty gritties of your research. I
Yeah.
really am excited about what your research shows because I'm in a practice. My colleagues and I, we're in a mix of, we've got folks who have their PhDs in psychology. I'm the only
Yeah.
marriage and family therapist at LMFT here, but we have social workers and then we have LPCs. But every single one of us, because we are so saturated in this work of trauma,
Hmm. Hmm.
all of us have, yeah, it's taken a toll. I
Yeah.
mean, it really has. And this isn't just something that's helpful for professionals. Your research, I feel like, has implications that extend to the everyday person.
Hmm.
So I'd like to kind of have you just kind of unpack that for us now.
Yeah, for sure. So I interviewed a number of child protection workers, and every single one of them had a history of childhood abuse or neglect. Um, Almost half of them had experienced some sort of childhood sexual abuse. Um, there was physical abuse. There was all kinds of stuff happening. And in fact, when you look at people that go into the helping professions, there tends to be, um, high ACE scores. There tends to be, a lot of stuff that went down. And I sort of suspected that one of the reasons why some people even get into a helping profession is because they're actually trying to make sense of or redeem that thing that happened to them. They're trying to give meaning to it, and they're trying to make it all worth it somehow, um, which is great, and can put up some real stumbling blocks, because sometimes when we have this trauma background, there can be this minefield that we don't even know exists. And so what I wanted to do is I just wanted to interview social workers about their childhoods, about some of the things that happened to them, and then sort of juxtapose that with the things that really stress them out at work. And what I found was that there was almost a hand in glove relationship between the things that those workers experienced and the things that really stressed them out. Of course, for social workers, there's lots of paperwork, high caseloads. It's a high stress environment. It's sort of a no-win environment, especially in child protection. If you remove the children, you're criticized for having done that. Like, oh, maybe you should have left them there. If you don't bring children into care, you're criticized. Well, why didn't you help them? And then on top of that, there's confidentiality. So all these other people can tell your narrative, but you're actually not allowed to explain your side of the story. So it represents this kind of double bind. But what I found was that we had this one person who she was really triggered by what she framed as narcissistic mothers, and what she said is that she would break law and policy to remove children from a home of a narcissistic mother, even if the law didn't warrant it, because she was convinced of the harm that would be done to them. Of course, when we dug into her history, we found, yeah, I mean that was her experience. She she had a narcissistic mother, and so she could relate in this way, but it also meant that she had a trigger, and a trigger is just kind of like a memory fragment that comes up. Um, and so what happens when we're triggered is we sort of stop being in the present moment, in the present relationship, and we time travel back to that place. When maybe we were helpless, when maybe we were really in trouble, and we stop seeing reality as it is, like objectively, and then we start taking action as though we were back there and not right here. And so that's why she said she would break the law to remove children. Um, I had another participant who she had been sexually abused by an uncle who is also a pastor, and the brutal thing was actually that when she went to her parents and disclosed to her parents, they minimized it and they brushed it off. And she was so disillusioned that she ran away from home. She was 16. She lived on the streets. She started using substances. Eventually, she cleaned up her life and was able to go back to school. But her major trigger is when she's working with parents that don't get it. That's her trigger. So if she feels like she's talking with a parent that's just not believing their child, not seeking to understand, she just really has a hard time controlling herself and controlling her reaction. And so we can sort of see there's a direct correlation between the thing that happened and then that thing that bears resemblance to what happened. Um, and then the other big point is just that we use this catch-all term burnout, um, and but it's shorthand for like a basket of things. It could be about a dozen different things that we just label as burnout. Maybe it is trauma. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's moral injury. That's another thing, especially for child protection workers. And I think it may have application to our family of churches as well. We have military vets who come back and they've done things. They've not just seen things, but they've done things that they feel deeply about. They feel this deep sense of woundedness and shame, and they don't know where to go with it. Like, what happens if you've done something? Hey, we're acting on behalf of your country. It was legal, but you just happen to enjoy it. Like, where do you go with that? That creates these complex emotions. And so, you know, when we're talking about it, we tended to say I'm burned out, but it might be so many different things. So I really wanted to shed some light on what some of those things might have been.
Help us to understand a little bit more regarding how someone who is listening to this, and let's say they're not a child protection worker and they don't
Yeah.
have the history of that. And I'll just say full disclosure, I worked, oh man, I worked as a therapeutic case manager, helping kids to be reintegrated back into homes. And then I
Yeah,
worked as an in-home intensive therapist, helping
right.
kids who had been reintegrated to stay in the home. And everything you're saying has so many. Oh man, I've also worked in substance abuse with kids who had parents who had their kids taken, and it's just trauma
Mhm.
360, literally. And
Yeah.
like you said, that sometimes there isn't really a win-win. Anyway, as far as people, they're different experiences. They
Yeah.
have different things they've had to attend to. How does this apply to people and fellowships?
hmm Well, for one thing, um, most people are fighting a battle you know nothing about.
Hmm.
It's easy to judge people's behaviors um, when we have no idea what's going on for them, frankly. Or maybe we knew them from 20 years ago, and we have this story running in our head about who we think they are. And actually, they haven't been that person. Actually, they were never that person. They certainly haven't been that person for the last 20 years. And yet, maybe we sort of avoid them in the fellowship because we think we know who they are and what they believe and what they do, what they're like, and we don't know anything. That's what I'm learning as I get older as a Christian. I'm realizing, man, I know so much less than I think I know. Um, and I think there's a huge parallel actually between um, the ICOC and protection workers. There is this sort of I can get this done attitude in our family of churches. And when we were being successful and like growing and baptizing and, like spreading like a weed, it's like nothing succeeds like success, right? It was sort of like, look at what we're producing. And, and, but with that came this sort of, mentality. I'm not a victim. I'm not, I don't want to be, I don't want to be a victim. And there was a strong group identity. We're the people that get it done. We get the job done. We go there. We talk about this stuff with people, and it's such a tough thing because the wonderful things, um, and the exciting things and those deeply meaningful things from our past are so interwoven with the um, abusive things and the traumatizing things. It's really hard to tease those apart. And I think the struggle is the same for child protection workers. It's like you're standing in the gap. You're doing really important work. It's also damaging you. And so the idea of like, well, maybe I shouldn't do this, maybe I should do this differently. It's so threatening to our identity that we'd rather just be damaged. We'd rather just die on that hill than make some shifts, right? And this is we conducted this research with ICUC ministers in 2019, right before the pandemic hit. And what it showed was that 53% of our ministry staff had moderate levels of burnout, but also showed that more than 50% had what's called high compassion satisfaction. So what that means is that our ICOC ministers, they were generally feeling burned out in ministry, and they found it deeply rewarding because those things really go together. And
Wow.
there's this thing called Avatar syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of that, but when the movie Avatar came out, um, people would like look at a sunset or walk in the woods and they'd be like, meh, like the colors just seem dull because they just watched this 3D computer generated movie with these brilliant colors. And it was like not just nature, it was like this hyper real version of nature. And then everything else just seemed kind of dull in comparison. And I think that happens for child protection workers that leave that field. Everything else is like, meh. And I think that happens for people in ministry too. It's like, how do you go to selling real estate after you've been saving souls for Christ? It just doesn't, it doesn't have that eternal superhero kind of feeling to it. And I think some of us have had to wrestle with that. And there's been a real, I remember talking to this brother once, and he just said, I just feel like I'm mourning the death of a dream. like we weren't exactly who we thought we were. We weren't destined to do what we said we were going to do. Like all of these, ambitions were kind of naive, and we were so young. You know, and I've been thinking about this a lot, but it's like our experience in our family of churches just happens to mirror our experience of life. Like we're all moving through life together. Most of us were baptized in Baptist ministry, some of us in teen ministry, and then we all just sort of got married at the same time and had kids at the same time, and we're living life together. We're kind of moving along the conveyor belt of life, and so there's a lot of congruence between the things we're experiencing, and what I've realized is that we were just young. We were just so young, and we didn't know. And I've been thinking about Moses a lot, and I feel like I'm monologuing at you at this point, but I'm just
Dude,
spilling it. I'm just telling you what I
I
think.
honestly, I'm just enjoying it. I feel
Okay, good.
ministered to, and I sometimes I just like to listen.
Okay. I get uncomfortable if I hear myself talking too long. I start wondering, like what's because I'm a counselor, right? So
Yep.
I should not be doing most of the talking in any
In
sort of
this moment, you
dyad,
get
right?
to.
Yes, I have the stage. Um, yeah, like I think about Moses, and what always struck me about Moses was these two ways that he's characterized. Um, you know, I think it was Paul that said that he was powerful in speech when he refers back to Moses in the New Testament. But then, Moses says to God, "Well, I'm slow in speech and tongue," right? He's like, I'm not very well spoken." And like, why that disconnect? So I sort of tracked his life, and I realized, oh, like, so he grew up very privileged. He had these like convictions, like I want to save my people. I want to save the Hebrew nation. And he kind of came out of the gate swinging, like very first thing he does is he murders an Egyptian. Like that's the very first thing he does. Second thing he does is he like tries to become this mediator, between two Israelites who are fighting. And it's like, do you even get Israelite culture? Like you grew up in a palace, like you don't know anything, but you know enough to be dangerous. That's the problem. You've got a few skills, you got a few convictions, you've got this righteous anger, and what has that resulted in? You murdering someone, and you basically getting into this argument that you know nothing about. And so then, like, God leads him out to Midian, right? Takes him to the desert to tend sheep for 40 years. He just like chills that guy out for 40 years,
He totally does.
right? Like, that's going to change you. You may be fast talking and have all the answers. Try 40 years in a desert with sheep, with a culture that's not yours. Like, you've got nothing to say, probably don't speak the language very well. Like, there's some reflection time there. And so then at the age of 80, God's like, okay, I think you're ready. At 80, you know? And it just made me think for us, like, I think it's felt discouraging. The letter came out and things seem to be falling, but this is grace. This is God's discipline. This is a measured hand of discipline from God. This is God loving us. When we're having to fight through difficult marriages and raising kids and kids that are just like we were, and it's like, oh gosh, like, okay, I think I'm starting to get it. These are all preparation for what's to come. And like you look at the qualifications for elders, they've all been ground down by life. They've all had stuff happen to them. They've been in a lot of different contexts. They've had to learn to look at life in a nuanced way. It's something they could have never had in their early 20s. Now we love people who are fired up in their early 20s. They've got this passion for God. And like I think it was Paul that said, like, I speak to you young men because you've escaped the evil one. That's a huge victory. That's to be celebrated, but it's not the end. And I think that, at least for me, when I, as this 18-year-old disciple, I thought it was the end. I thought I'd reached this pinnacle of spirituality because I was perfectly obeying the Bible. And I'm I'm like the first person to fully understand scripture as God intended it, and to be perfectly living it out. It's like
That's so funny.
it's a little bit embarrassing, but it's I just love that God is gracious and he's working with us. And I think the best really is yet to come.
Thank you for saying that, because I think some people, it's kind of like fake it till you make it, or act as if. We start to try to manufacture perseverance.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's kind of like when you have an athlete who gets injured. I mean, that's the one thing that stops the train, is that you get injured. And what I have found is kind of interesting. Like, I tore my Achilles 3 or 4 years ago. Stupid. Yeah. Anyway, I thought I was younger than I really am. And so when I got injured, when it was time to do rehab, I could go back. And then what I wanted to do is I wanted to hit the weights, and I wanted to build the big muscles, right?
Mhm.
Well, I had this little calf, and it still needs work. Anyway, I had this little calf, and when I go to the gym, again, I want to work the big muscles, but I need to do rehab. And what I realized that I was kind of struggling with is that I'm a little bit more accepting of being weak than being injured. Weak versus being wounded.
Right.
And so I want to
Right.
work the big muscles versus do rehab, which is addressing the injury.
Mhm.
And so it's just, over time, to your point, we get nicked. And then we need
Yeah.
to do actual rehab emotionally, in terms of trauma, in terms of actually building true resilience. And then that's a sign of maturity, right? Is to
Mhm.
actually do
Mhm.
rehab, to do emotional healing, to where we don't stay either euthymic. Euthymic is a fancy word for being kind of just this, where we're out of touch. We feel basically from the neck up. Or a
Yeah.
fancy term would be alexithymic, which is we can't name what we feel, right?
Right.
The
Right.
point is that I think some of us, to your point with that the grit theology,
Mhm.
we, and I myself kind of am that way too, because I was raised that way, is I can deal with weakness, but what I really can't deal with is being wounded, to
Mm.
admit that. And so what I'm hearing you say to some degree is that those who mature are those who are focused on healing at a primary level.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right, and I appreciate you saying that. I think you said nicked. I think the young people these days are saying scuffed. That's what my son says. He's like, "Dad, that's scuffed." I'm like, okay. Um, yeah. I love what you're saying, because I think that when we're young, most of us don't have to deal with that sense of woundedness. Of course, wounds are crucial. I mean, it's by
Mm,
Christ's wounds we are healed.
absolutely.
And I remember I used to love studying the Bible with people, and trying to like paint this new picture of Jesus that wasn't so like lame and petting a little lamb, and he was more like a superhero, right? But actually, he's not like a superhero in so many ways. He's very human.
Yeah.
And the irony is that Jesus wasn't a martyr. He
Hmm.
I mean, he died for us, but he wasn't a martyr. He learned how to take care of himself. And I think that's a big piece that was missing with me for a long time. He, even when he was talking about loving other people, he said like, no one ever hated his own body. Like, he just
Hmm.
says it sort of almost like a throwaway comment, like, well, of course nobody ever hated his own body. He feeds and cares for it. But I think we've sort of, a lot of us have been in the habit of not caring for our own bodies, not caring about ourselves, not slowing down. But going back to the scriptures, you see how Jesus is. I mean, he's not afraid to sleep on a boat when everyone else is freaked out. He doesn't care. Oh, how am I going to come across? I'm the leader. I'm the leader here. I need to be awake, and I need to be at the front. I need to be steering. He didn't care about bad PR. He often would leave the crowds. Like, I want to do a study where all I look at is all the times Jesus was like rebuked and challenged by his disciples, because that's kind of like the way I think in my humanistic ways. Like, Jesus, like, I don't know if you made all the right decisions when you were walking around on earth. Like, you could have had so much more of an impact. Like, when Satan offered you all the kingdoms of the world, think about what you could have done. Like, you could have had so much. You could have, you could have saved everyone right there, like, because I'm so smart, I know so much more than Jesus. But it's like I know intellectually, yeah, Jesus is right. He's just right. And yet more and more areas of my life, I see I'm just not living like him, because I'm actually following a caricature of Jesus and not the real Jesus. It's the Jesus in my head who I want him to be. It's funny. We had Tim Summerlin come to Vancouver a couple months ago, and he does these Disciples in Motion workshops. And by the way, if anyone gets the chance to have Tim come to your church and do those workshops, like, do it. It's like, I mean, he practically gives it away, and it's so helpful. That's my little plug for Tim there. But
I
I
concur.
realized, yeah, I had this moment when he was talking, when I was actually like, I don't know, Tim, like, he was talking about Jesus feeling anxiety. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, I realized I've only given Jesus permission to feel anxiety once, and that was before he went to the cross. That's the only time. It's like, if you're about to be killed for your faith, then it's okay to wrestle with God and feel anxiety. But he actually pointed out all these other places where he thought, yeah, Jesus probably felt some strong negative emotions. Um, and I realized I'm uncomfortable with that. I don't like that. I want my Jesus to look more like Captain America, who like pulls a rabbit out of a hat, and and saves me, and who is crowned in heaven. And I forget the humanness of Jesus, and yet his humanness is really like the trail of breadcrumbs for us mere mortals to follow.
I think let me just say this real quick. I think you're
Yeah.
nailing something that kind of gets into how to overcome disillusionment. So one of the things
Yeah.
that I'm thinking is that you have people who, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, this idea that people's glory days are in the past,
Yeah.
or that, this idea of I'm burned out and I feel disillusioned because what's the point?
Yeah.
And like you said, this avatar syndrome where it's like, if we just reverse that and we say the glory days, that's kind of, even when you look when the temple was rebuilt, and I've been reading Ezra and Nehemiah,
Mm,
this idea of the grief, because it was a shadow of what it was when they rebuilt the temple.
yeah.
And so the elders grieved because they knew what it was. They knew what it used to be. And so I think there's this chronic disappointment. You meet people who are just chronically disappointed. And there's this disillusionment of, how do I recapture my mojo spiritually?
Right. Right.
Let me just kind of throw out a subconscious hypothesis here,
Okay.
because ladies and gentlemen, this is I would say, world-class researcher. I've got some things I want to do in terms of research, and he would be my primary consultant on research. One of the things I want to research is the subconscious connection between zeal and immaturity. In other words, sometimes people try to muster themselves up to I'm going to go and I'm going to take on the world, or whatever I'm
Right.
going to do. I'm going to be zealous again. Well, subconsciously, I also think there's a contradiction that people have, and they want to be zealous, but their zeal is kind of associated, like you were talking about, with immaturity.
Mhm.
And so there's two kind of opposing factors, I think, working sometimes in people, is like, what does that look like after a marriage and a mortgage?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And but subconsciously, sometimes there can be these little components down, there's little particles of, yeah, but when I was zealous, kind of like what you were saying, I made a lot of judgments. I made a lot of assumptions. And so
Yeah.
how do I now create zeal that's linked with maturity? And so
Mhm.
that's something I'm kind of wondering about, if there's a connection. That's my diatribe. All
I
right, we're done
love
with it.
it. I love it.
But anyway, yeah, just that in terms of the disillusionment, that's kind of what I really wanted to talk about just for a
Mhm.
moment, the disillusionment. What's something that you kind of think might be a key factor in dealing with that?
Yeah. Well, there's this idea of transferable skills,
Hmm.
and I think any of us who's been married, um, I don't know about you, but just to be really honest, I married a fantasy. I thought I knew my wife. I knew very little about my wife when I married her. I had this image in my head of who she was. And the funny thing about, uh, you know, not knowing someone, especially someone you really like, is that in the absence of knowing that thing, our brains will naturally put the best possible scenario in that spot, right? And then what happens is you get married, and slowly that mental construct starts to crack, and sometimes it shatters. We realize, oh, I married a stranger. Like, this person I married, she's all kinds of different than I thought she was. Um, and that's actually when the decision to love becomes so crucial. And it goes the other way too, because of course they're getting to know who we really are. Because it's so easy to like front, when you're dating, it's like I spent every last penny I had on Aaron when we were dating. I mean, no, like no
Don't get
joke.
yourself in trouble, bro. I
Hey,
just
no,
want to. I'm kidding. I'm messing with you.
no, yeah, I it's funny on our honeymoon. I remember we had this discussion about bank accounts. We hadn't yet merged our bank accounts, and she's like, "So, like, how much money do you have in your bank account? I'm just curious, just for planning." And I'm like, "Oh, I have like $7 in my bank account." And she's like, "What?" Like, yeah, like I'm out of money. Like, and that was the first time we talked about it, was on our honeymoon, because and I had wined and dined her. I had taken her out to all these fancy restaurants, and I, in hindsight, I realized I portrayed myself in a way that was not actually true. And we both did. And but then what we have is this opportunity, now that we know the truth, to love based on knowledge, right? Because it's like zeal without knowledge. So the trick is, and this is what I think you're getting at, is how do you have zeal in spite of what you know? And I think that's what happens, is like we just know too much. We've heard the stories, we've been in the situations, we've seen the ugly. How do you keep coming back? How do you renew? um, and I think if I, they say advice is autobiography. If I had one piece of advice to give, I know Sabbath is the thing right now that everyone's talking about, and I think Sabbath is crucial because it does mean rest. And rest is not the absence of something, by the way. Like, it's rest isn't like the space between appointments in your day timer. It's like actually something deliberate that needs to be planned, but that's its own conversation. I think one of the reasons why having Sabbath is so crucial is that it's actually time to reflect. It's time to just stop. I mean, that's what Sabbath means, is stop. It's a time to think. And I think when we're feeling a lot of emotional pain and stress, one of the ways we cope is by dissociating. We don't want to think. We don't, there's a fear that if we let the waves, you know, calm down to see, so that you can see down to the bottom, that we'll be terrified about what we find down there. I remember swimming out to a buoy in the ocean once, and I had goggles. It was the first time I ever did it, and I remember looking at this chain that had mussels growing on it, and as it sort of spiraled down and down and down, probably 200 feet. It was terrifying, and I swam back as fast as I could. It was so scary to look down into the depths, and I think it's just so easy for us to be busy and distracted on our phones. Um, and it's like, yeah, we can blame Facebook, we can blame, the phone company, we can blame Apple. Um, but my question is, like, what thing am I avoiding? There might just be, I just might need some time to reflect, and work some of that stuff out. That might be terrifying. Um, so I think that's why Sabbath matters. And I think for people in ministry, gosh, what a hard job. Um, it makes me think of, especially when things are going badly, like it makes me think of David, who, like, even in the Psalms, that you see he's got enemies all around, people with daggers ready. I think sometimes, social threat is equally, if not more, stressful than physical threat. At least with a physical threat, maybe like the bear comes out of the woods. You either run from the bear, or the bear runs from you, or you fight the bear, or, something happens, it ends. You complete the stress cycle, right? And then you can go back to not feeling stressed. But social stress is so different because um, it's sort of these ghosts all around. You don't know what people think. You don't know what narratives are being told behind your back. And I think we've seen a lot of that. I think we see a lot of gossip and storytelling and um, you know character assassination that happens, and we know that that exists, and it's very stressful. And I think there's something primal there because of course, like 5,000 years ago, if you were ostracized from the group, it would usually mean certain death. So it was important to maintain social ties within your group. And that's a huge part of the job, is just maintaining all of this web of relationships. And if you're new to a church, like you're just starting to, lead a church, it's like you don't even know what that pre-existing context looks like, And then there's always like that first person, like there's this Canadian saying, like, always be careful about the person who meets you at the train. And I could have some Canadian go, I've never heard that saying, but it's like, who's the first person to reach out to you when you show up in a city? It's like either they've got either they want to be the first to manage their own reputation, or they want to be the first to tell you what's wrong with the church, or whatever, right? And it's and I can only
so
say that because
funny.
I've been that guy. Okay, so let me just own that. Yeah, so I think it's really stressful, and without that margin and that time to reflect and that time to like let everything settle down in life, um, I just don't know how somebody could succeed, and Lord forbid, actually enjoy their lives.
Well, so it's funny you talk about this idea of communal, the lack of Sabbath communal in the
Yeah,
communal scale.
yeah.
And I think it's very true that the basic social tissues have been ruptured.
Yeah.
And to your point, like that's a part of recovery, that like you talk about the stress cycle. Well, that stress cycle is partly about being able to turn to someone. And when Jesus went his greatest time of need, like you were saying before, he turned to his friends.
Hmm.
And so that, but again, if there are some, just basic assumptions that have been shattered about being able to trust people, right? Right. So Sabbath is a lack, trauma is a lack of Sabbath on the inside, but it's not just a
Hmm.
lack of Sabbath internally or individually, it's a lack of Sabbath in terms of community. And I think to some degree, you're right on. And I guess that's the question, is can we really trust one another? Well, what we know, and you see this from the research too, is that healthy people risk.
Yeah.
Our ability to risk. And so when I think about disillusionment, kind of bringing
Hmm.
it all full circle,
Yeah.
disillusionment I think is a disease that really kind of creeps in, and it erodes our ability to risk. And it
Hmm.
erodes that ability to take a chance, and then to know that God's got us, or to know that we have the internal capacities for repair.
Hmm.
Or we've got the conflict management skills, and some of it's will, some of it's skill, right? Some of us, we
Right.
just don't have the skills to do repair at the next level. The point is I love what you're saying regarding when it comes to being able to turn to people, and if you can't trust people, and like you said with ministers too, life gets really tough. It's
Yeah.
already lonely being a minister. It's already
Yeah.
lonely being a Christian. It's lonely being a human being. Like there's an inherent
Hmm.
loneliness built into our heart beating.
Yeah.
It's just there's an aspect of being alive, that there's a loneliness that we want to medicate. So I kind of like what you're saying, and you're bringing the technology part of it in it too. I think you're absolutely right. I was thinking yesterday with my son, he just kept coming in wanting
Mm.
attention, and I'd give him attention, but I get right back on my phone, or I had a meeting and I had this and that, and I'm like, I can't live like that. I'm never going to get this time back with him. And I'm going to want influence later in his life. Like you were saying, I
Hmm.
think you have a 10, 13, and 16-year-old. The
Yeah.
influence, it gets built before then.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true.
So,
And
yeah,
yeah, and it's all about the plank and the speck. Like
Mm,
that's been our parenting philosophy has totally shifted over the last 10 years. I
really?
mean, yeah, we used to have this real law and order approach. Um, and like obey the first time and all this stuff. And some of that stuff is important. I don't want to disparage that, but more and more I realize um, I just need to work on me. Even
Yeah.
with my own kids, the number one thing I can do is just try to love Jesus, like me love Jesus, not me lead a devotional with my family to
Wow.
teach them to love Jesus, And it's funny because my son, he freaks me out, but he I got mad at him the other day about something, and he's like, Dad, I think you're projecting onto me. And I'm like, this is like the son of a counselor, right? And
Oh
he's totally
man.
right too. That's what's terrifying about it. And when I really thought about it, it's like, yeah, I'm angry because this thing you did reminded me of something I did when I was your age that really hurt me, and
Wow.
I'm really scared that you're going to go down the same road. And so really, I'm not angry. Really, I'm just really I'm scared. And oh, that's hard. And how do you do that when it's like this is the only thing that matters during family time? It's just we're just on these, right? Like this is like this is like a great gift from God and a tool of Satan at the same time.
Hmm.
Like so many things in life, right? And it's funny because I've got my oldest son Noah. I've got his screen time locked down, and I can see where he goes and what he does and on his phone. And but what I've realized is I spend way more time on my phone than he does, right? So I'm a
That's
hypocrite.
humble
It's
to
humble.
admit that.
And what did I lead with? I became an atheist because of the hypocrisy I saw in the church in my family. You know, and oh, here we are, history repeating itself.
Hmm.
And but the only way I could figure any of that out is because I've given myself a bit of margin. Okay, the pandemic has given me a bit of margin. Jesus via the pandemic has given me the margin to
Yeah.
sort of connect some of these dots. So
Well, bless you. I want to ask you just briefly in terms of any upcoming announcements. I mean, you're a
yeah,
professor. I mean, you've got people you
yeah.
supervise, you've got people you teach, you've got research you're doing in the church. You've got a lot of irons in the fire. What do you want to tell us about?
There's a lot of stuff going on. You're right. Uh, we've been discussing. So I'm part of the Ministers' Health Subcommittee, as I know
Mhm.
you're as well now, and which is great. Um, we're talking about a lot of things to really help ministry staff over the next few years, kind of sort some of this out. We want to be a resource. Um, I know there's some books in the works. I think I'm going to be co-authoring a book with someone here, and there's the possibility of doing some research around Sabbath as an intervention for ministry staff. Um, but I'm also building a course. So what I do is I train social workers. I train graduate level social workers to be clinicians, um, and so I do a lot of coaching and training with them around vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, all that stuff. But I thought, I've been on this social work track for a long time, and I think God actually put me into that field so that He could bring me back, um,
Mm.
and really help people of faith. And so my big risk is I'm making the leap back. And so what I've put together is a special training for your audience, um, and it's at my website. It's called the web address. I wrote it down. It's my name, seanstjean.com /Kyle Spears.
Okay.
So if you go there, you can
Oh,
get
that's
this.
too cool. Wow.
I know, yeah, that's just for you, and it's for your viewers.
Oh
So
man, we're about that.
yeah,
Wow.
and so because I wrote down like a ton of notes leading up to this. I realized this interview could go like 100 different ways,
Yeah.
and there are just a few things that I think might help some people who are
Yes.
really feeling a lot of emotional pain right now around where they're at in ministry. Like this survey we did with all the ministers, it revealed that almost 25% of our ministry staff are looking to get out of the ministry.
Mm.
22% would quit the ministry right now if they had the financial means to do so. And so I just want to do everything I can to keep people in the game, but in a healthy way. Because I think that at the end of the day, um, it's okay to enjoy your life. Like hard things will come. That's God's job. is to give us hard things,
Hmm.
and he does that in a very careful way, in a disciplined way. He disciplines us in a disciplined way. And soundbite,
Yeah, it
hashtag.
is.
Do people still
It
do
is.
hashtags? I don't know, but um, I think it's okay to actually enjoy your time on Earth before we make it to heaven. Um, and in Ecclesiastes it says that we should find happiness in all our hands have to do, and so yeah, so that's what I've got, and people can check it out there. And but Kyle, yeah, it's been great chatting with you, and thank you for your insight and your thoughtful questions. Um, and hopefully at some point I can interview you and maybe pick your brain a little bit.
Oh, it's done.
Uh,
It's
yeah,
done. It's done. And I just want our listeners to know for a moment, dude, you have a strong sense of humor. It's kind of cool. I say at the end of my interview, we all know that we are with you and God is for you. One day, I think it was maybe we were over Zoom, maybe it was a committee meeting or whatever it was, and you were like, we are with you and God is for you. And I was just like, so when you come onto my channel, I just thought in that moment, this is going to be a comedic moment
right.
because of that. And I'm going to say it anyway, though. We are
Amen,
with
brother.
you, Sean. We are with you, and God is absolutely for you. And
Mhm.
the reason why I say God is for us is because, I think sometimes we don't really believe that
Yeah,
God is for us. And
yeah,
he is, and he's always been, he's for us. And
yeah.
I think it's powerful if you really lunge into it. I think it is powerful, but also
Amen.
cheesy.
It's cheesy, but it's cheesy. We say things are cheesy when they actually hit our heartstrings, and we
Hmm.
don't, we don't want to savor that emotion we're feeling. So we say that's cheesy. But it's true.
Man, you can name things so well. Well, thank you so much. If you've been with us this entire time, so many of you are. You guys watch it over and over. And I guys, seriously, I am so grateful for this time that we get to have. And so many of you are supportive. Please like, share, subscribe, post it on social media if you find something helpful. The other thing I would say is that, if you want to subscribe, please do. One thing I've realized in the YouTube algorithm is that if people subscribe but they don't watch, it messes up things in terms of the algorithm and where the video gets pushed. So you actually want people who subscribe to watch. Otherwise, it creates a red flag for the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, no worries there. I'll see you next time.